So on that note, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Robert Diggs, and I am the Community and Partnerships Lead for RSA US. On behalf of Octavia and Christabel and my new colleague, Claire, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this month's US Salon Behind the Mic Diversifying Podcasting. Before we get started, I'd like to give a little background on the RSA, RSA US, and cover some ground rules about today's event. Founded in the UK, RSA stands for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, and has been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. Today, the Society exists as an international fellowship-driven think tank committed to providing an independent platform for research and debate on contemporary issues and topics. Of the 30,000 fellows spread out around the globe, about 1,100 live and work here in the United States, including Octavia and Christabel. RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the United States with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequities of our society. Before I turn things over to Octavia, I'd like to cover some ground rules about today's event. As you'll see on the slide in front of you, and again, to remind you, this event is being recorded. The chat is available to you to raise points of clarification. I will track that just to help raise them to Octavia and or Christabel. So don't hesitate to speak up. We are a global audience coming from different backgrounds, cultures, and countries, but be respectful at all times. Use language that your mother or mom would approve of. I do not hesitate to remove people from our events that do not follow this basic norm. We will use the chat to collate questions for the Q&A portion at the end. So feel free to ask questions along the way, but it will help if you if you hold questions towards the end. There's a last question that we'll ask Christabel about podcasts. During that question, you can start to ask your questions of our speakers. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen so that you, if I can, of course, the ways of Zoom, sometimes you have to take an extra step to do that. But with that, I will turn things over to Octavia to introduce Christabel. Octavia.
Oh, thank you, Diggs. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name's Octavia Goredema. I'm a career coach at 2010 Agency, and I'm based in Los Angeles. I've been a fellow of the RSA for a decade now, and I lead the Gender Equity Network here in the United States. Equity matters more than ever before, and we host these virtual salons to bring people together from inside and outside of the RSA to share perspectives, discuss strategies, and forge connections. Today, we are discussing diversity in podcasting with our special guest, Christabel Nsiah-Buadi of Spotify. Now, it's been estimated that more than 1/3 of Americans listen to podcasts regularly. Over the past year, on-demand audio has continued to become more and more popular. Despite this, diversity in podcasting remains a challenge. Spotify's global program, Sound Up, was launched 3 years ago in 2018 to address this. Through Sound Up, Spotify gives underrepresented podcasters the tools to boost their platforms through workshops and education. Earlier this year, Spotify unveiled the Behind the Mic Fellowship for Black creatives who want to transfer their skills into the podcast industry. Our guest today, Christabel Nsiah-Buadi, leads Spotify's Behind the Mic Fellowship. Now, Christabel's extensive career on both sides of the Atlantic is embodied in her accomplishments as a journalist, producer, and podcast development consultant. Christabel's production company, MyLens Media, produces culturally nuanced podcasts. Her clients include Macro, the Hollywood production company, and the Webby-nominated podcast Sister Brunch. Before Christabel made the switch to podcasting, she had an award-winning career in public radio. She ran shows for NPR and Public Radio International. Now, we're both based in Los Angeles, but Christabel's career has taken her to different corners of the world. She has covered Ghana's 50th anniversary. She's reported on detentions at Guantanamo Bay. She's produced live coverage of Hurricane Katrina, and she was the voice of the Africa Channel's coverage of Nelson Mandela's death in 2013. In addition, Christabel has covered all but one of the US presidential elections since 2004. Christabel, thank you so much for being here today. Now, I'm a career coach, And one of the things that I love the most is when I see people in my network announcing exciting new roles. And I just happened to be on Twitter when I saw Christabel announce her new role at Spotify. And I tweeted her congratulations, and that tweet resulted in us connecting and her being here with us today. So thank you, Christabel.
Thank you very, very much. I was having a bit of a tech issue there. Is that all me? I should say that I started when I was about 2 years old. That's a lot of stuff. It's so funny to hear that still. But yes, I've had a wonderful adventure, and it's lovely to hear all that stuff back, because it's been an incredible time. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you for being here. And I have a number of questions for you about podcasting, diversity, your career, but it's incredibly important that we hold space for everyone's questions. So as Dick said, if you're listening and you have a question for Christabel, please, please, please do share it in the chat as you think of it. Pop it in there. We'll be holding space for questions before we complete our time together today. So let's get started. Christabel, your professional journey began in England before moving here to the States. You've written for prestigious newspapers like The Independent, magazines like Vogue. You've won awards as a public radio broadcaster, and you run your own production company, My Lens Media. Now you're helping underrepresented podcasters reach new audiences. What attracted you to the Behind the Mic program that you're spearheading for Spotify?
Really, it's mission aligned with my own personal and professional one. I, as a journalist and just as a human being, I got into journalism because I wanted to hear all the voices. I remember as a child listening to the coverage in Northern Ireland and saying to my dad, if I want to cover Northern Ireland, why does everyone in Northern Ireland have a Northern Irish accent? Why don't I see people who don't look white or don't sound different? And my dad said, well, people generally cover that area because they are most likely the experts on that topic, which is valid. And I understood that, and to this day, I absolutely, believe that. But then I wasn't seeing different kinds of people covering different kinds of topics. And growing up in the UK, when they were covering issues that affected African people or Black people in general, I wasn't seeing Black people covering those topics. So what I wanted to do, and I had a strong sense of justice, was and I also wanted to be famous. Let's be real about that. As a kid, you equate power and influence with all of that and the fame. But what I saw was me wanting to see other people who looked like me, the brilliant people who looked like me that I grew up with, on the screen, sharing and talking about our stories. And of course, as I got older, that need to be seen on the big screen kind of melted away. But that desire to make sure that all voices, not just voices of African people or Ghanaian people or Black British people, but working class people, I wanted to hear those voices on the TV. And throughout my career, I found myself just covering lots of different events where I was looking for the voices that were stifled in the silence. I was looking for those voices and wanting to bring them to the microphone, and not to interview them so that I could interpret what they said. I wanted literally to hand them the mic and say, what is it like? How are you responding to this? And what kind of agency do you have? Because it wasn't just about reporting from the outside, it was showing the world that people had agency. And so throughout my career, that's been a theme that has echoed. And when I worked for National Public Radio, I was given the opportunity to bring those voices to the forefront, because I worked for a show that covered the diversity and celebrated the nuance of the African American experience, but they were looking to do something more global as well. And so again, that was a wonderful opportunity. So at every point in my career, I have created opportunities to tell those stories and to hear the stories from those people. And so when Behind the Mic it came up, I'd been in the business for 20 years. I'd been doing podcasts for 10 years, long before people even thought podcasting was interesting. I understood it to be an exciting and viable place to explore stories. And Behind the Mic approached me and said, is this something, or I should say Sound Up the Sound Up team approached me and said, is this something you'd be interested in? And the more I talked, the more I said I was compelled to do it. Really.
It was meant to be.
It was meant to be. It really was.
It was meant to be. So tell us a little bit more about what it encompasses and where you're at now. I know it was announced earlier this year. What have you been working on and what's about to come?
I have been, so I joined in March and I developed the program between March and August. And then we launched, and I should say we launched by introducing our 3 fellows. So I should say I launched in March. I developed it in March. It was pretty much done by May or June. Don't ask me how I did it, but I did. And then we put applications out, and we got applications from all over the world, actually. I became very popular on LinkedIn. People were really trying to be my friend and trying to figure out how they could get involved in the program, because it's just based in the United States for now, I should say. And we got 300 applicants in 4 weeks.
Wow.
And they were incredible. I wasn't surprised by that, but I was very moved by that, because what that told me is that there are Black creatives out there who have been excluded from the workplace in terms of podcasting, which we know, which is the reason why we created it, who are willing to bet on themselves and who trusted us to help them develop the next part of their career and transfer their established skills. So we had people from ESPN, NPR, Christian Industries, like really high caliber people, and I could only select 3 people. So 1% of that application pool we could only accept. So we picked 3, and in August it launched. And our 3 incredible fellows have started. We had a month of getting to know each other and technical development. And now they're on their job placements, and they are working with their teams and showing people how incredible they are. But part of the program, it's not just about on-the-job training, so to speak. They also get to meet leaders in the podcasting field. And those leaders that we source are Black and brown people and allies. And they talk to them, and we have these workshops once a week. And so that's what we're doing. And then they're going to be moving on to develop their own podcast, which I'm very excited about.
That is brilliant. So from 300 to 3. Wow. That's just incredible. And so I love what you have shared about how this work really is a continuation of just a commitment and passion that you have to showcase underrepresented voices and amplify those voices. And you mentioned about you've been in podcasting for a decade, even before most people were fully aware of what the capabilities were of the platform. And it strikes me that podcasting has the potential to democratize audio. But the most important thing that always front of mind for me, I think, is that the most prominent voices seem to be white, male, or celebrities. Why is this still the case?
Because the loudest voices get the most attention. And, when it's that, but also when people realized that podcasting was a viable entity, which is not when I started it, I could not find anyone they didn't know what to do with a podcast. They didn't know what to do with digital content when I started it. And the fact of the matter is, podcasting is an industry that's burgeoning at the moment. And so people are trying to figure out, well, how do we get to do this and monetize it, right? So the potential lies in the fact that, all you need is an RSS feed and a way to record your content, right? So a lot of people still think that podcasting is, I get my phone, speak in it, get some of my homies, get them to talk about stuff that we're interested in, and then upload it. But it's far more, detailed than that in terms of creating compelling content. So, people who started to realize that there was a way in which we could monetize it, or a way to make it more compelling, were already in the audio industry, for example. They're already in radio. And as we all know, and if we don't, in the United States in particular, a lot of the leading voices or companies in podcasts, or certainly of the past, like the Wonderies and the Gimlets of this world, were created by public media people. And public media as we all know, or we should, has a diversity problem. I was about to say challenge. I was like, let's be real with what it is, right? But a lot of those people who work in those spaces are white men or older. And I say that as somebody who comes from the public media space, and I'm not a white man, but I was not one of many who ran public media shows, which I did, and that was unusual then. So very well-meaning and very well-meaning people created these companies because they were frustrated with what they saw in public media, or because they just wanted to make a change, or because they wanted to do some long-form stuff. Now, those people are extremely talented, absolutely, there's no denying it, but they are the people who also got the most attention because they had the resources. And then what happens when you get the resources, people start to pay attention. So it's almost like there's a recreation of the same cycle, because no one was really intentionally paying attention to the fact that in order to democratize, you have to look elsewhere. People in the media don't necessarily look elsewhere. People in general are going to look where they are for the most part, no matter where you come from, no matter who you are. And so when something is happening and happening fast, unless you have access to those resources, or even feel like you need to spend the time to look elsewhere, you're not going to do that. And I think that by nature, media is risk averse in that sense. Yes. And so we have a situation where there are very talented people, but you're going to go with the entity that you know. And if you don't look outside of that, then you're going to recreate things from the past.
And as you say, it's a burgeoning industry. And I'm certain some of the people with us today either have a podcast of their own or would love to have a podcast of their own. What advice would you have for a podcaster who is worried about how to compete with the loudest voices and those large platforms?
I'd say don't compete with those largest voices and the platforms. I think the beauty about podcasting and what people are learning, including those loudest voices, is that podcasting or podcasts work best when they understand who their audience is. So go narrow, don't go broad. Don't try and, you're creating your podcast because you want to tell your own story. You're creating your own podcast because you're trying to show something new. So rather than trying to tell that story to all the people all the time, lean into who you are, lean into the story that you're trying to tell, and then really create these very, very deep roots. Look at the way that you're telling that story. There's a million ways to tell those stories. So listen to all of those podcasts, listen to the different formats, listen to the way those stories are told, but really, really lean into who you are and be consistent about how often you tell those stories. I think a lot of people don't realize how much work goes into producing a podcast. And so you start and then you realize, I've got to produce another one next week, and how am I going to do all of this? So give yourself the time and the space to really sit down and look at what it is that you need to produce your podcast, right? You don't have to have all the resources, as in money, right? You have the resources. You just got to look at what you have and figure out how best you can and should proceed.
So let's talk about the work that goes into having a podcast. And let's talk about this a little. What would you say are the most common misconceptions people have about podcasting?
They're all recorded in someone's room or garage. I really, really believe that. And I see that with my fellows as well. They're very talented. They're writers, and they come from Carnegie Mellon, or they worked, on a show, or one of them is he is an incredibly talented audio engineer, right? Who's worked in different parts of the world. But every week when I talk to them about podcasting, every week they just kind of go, oh, okay, because it requires time, it requires planning, it requires a lot of project management, and it requires a lot of research, not just from the topic, but from the what is my show going to be about? How am I what is the format going to be? So in other words, how am I going to present this information? Is it going to be an interview show? Am I going to get audio? How am I going to get that audio? If I'm going to record it, what am I going to record it with? Am I going to record it with my phone? Am I going to record it on a microphone? And if I do that, how am I going to get that audio from there onto, iTunes or Spotify or wherever else so that everybody else can hear it? And people often, I think, fall at the first hurdle because they're completely overwhelmed by the planning that is needed for that before you even get onto the microphone. How am I going to book a guest?
It's a lot. And I think that's a really interesting segue to talk about you and the work that you do, because you have a production company, My Lens Media. You've produced a Webby-nominated podcast, Sister Brunch. What inspired you to do this and to start this company and help other people overcome all of these hurdles that you've talked about?
What inspired me? I found myself in a position where I was hearing that I had a reputation as a really effective show leader. I could, there's a story, I could turn it around. I understood what the really important idea of that story was. I knew how to get the right person to produce the show, or I could produce a segment, or I could produce that themselves. I was working as a senior supervising producer for a national news show on NPR. I may have said that already. So I was hearing and I was feeling more confident about my ability to get different voices, because the other thing I was hearing was, oh, they have really, really interesting voices. Where did they find those people? Now I found those people because I had a huge, just to age myself, Rolodex of contacts who that no one else had thought of, but I'd never understood why people hadn't reached out to them, because what I would often hear is, well, they put on the radio. What do they sound like? And I used to be like, well, they sound good. They can string many words together, and I have a really interesting story. But then I used to second guess myself and think, well, I'm not from the United States. My people are from Ghana, so I'm attuned to hearing foreign accents, so maybe that's a bad thing. But actually, that was my superpower, because what that meant was I could hear the story. And so my other superpower is I can pitch really well because I understand the importance of story. So coming out of that and then seeing that there was a real need to have underrepresented voices, not just from the Black diaspora, which is where a lot of my heart lies, but in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, right? Whatever that thing is, I was like, we need to get more of these voices on there. So I decided to, when my show ended, I was asked to move to DC and maybe try out and figure out working for one of the shows there. And I decided, no, I actually want to return to Los Angeles, because I didn't want to move for another job. But I really wanted to try and see if I could make this thing work, because I did not want to work for people or for an organization or for a show where I was constantly having to explain, tell, and justify why we needed to have those voices. I wanted to find a new way to get those voices in there, because people would take pictures from me. So why not try it another way? Why not take that pitch from the outside rather than working it from the inside? So that's essentially why I decided to start My Lens Media.
Yeah, you just felt it and you knew, and you're not dating yourself with a Rolodex. I didn't even have as sophisticated a Rolodex. I had, those index cards in the box and all of my contacts are on the index cards. This is like 21 years ago. So I hear you on that. And so you passed on an opportunity in DC. You came to Los Angeles. What happened next?
Well, I started my company. Freaked out for a very long time because I am the child of immigrants, and financial security and job security is everything. And I wasn't going to work for this big company, like, what are you doing, right? But kudos to my parents. They did not say that to me. They may have, I think they definitely, I got a lot of, which I understood to be, yeah, we don't like that. But they were supportive of me. I was very insecure about everything, but it took a little while. But I started then producing content for a lot of public media stations here, including KCRW. I contracted with them for a year. They asked me to develop some aspects of their programming. I ended up producing stuff for KPCC. And then I developed a show called Home from Home, which is still my love, where I basically, this is the podcast, I basically interviewed people from the African diaspora and thinkers and artists about the concept of home and about how they were trying to recreate their home in Los Angeles. Home as a concept and as an idea is very, very big for me. It's another big theme throughout my career because I'm fascinated by it. You know, I was born in Scotland. My folks are from Ghana. We are from Ghana, right? And then I'm living in the US. There's a huge story there, which I'm sure I'll write about one day in my book. So I have to write. You know, but I was finding that a lot of people, especially in Los Angeles, there are so many people that moved to Los Angeles with the concept. I wanted to know, how do you start to feel at home? What are the things that are important to you? And how are you bringing your flavor to this city that on paper is very diverse, but in a lot of ways is very segregated because we all live in our little bubbles. KCET online loved the concept and said, why don't you do a limited series for us? Wow. So that's what I did.
Wow, that's incredible. And, you know, that really resonates with me as someone born in Nottingham, England, of Zimbabwean heritage, you know, a US citizen now, and living and working and raising a family here in Los Angeles. And that concept of home is it's quite a nuanced one. Yes, it is. And we all have stories. And what you said earlier about leaning into who you are versus trying to fit or fit things into other places, I think is a really powerful one. Now, you've worked in Africa, Europe, now here. You started a new role during a pandemic. You started a company.
I like trouble.
Yes, you've done so many different things, and so many people, myself included, people I work with, we're contemplating taking leaps of different kinds, and it can be absolutely terrifying. As someone who has done that, Christabel, what advice do you have?
About taking leave?
Yeah.
Right now?
Yeah.
Right now?
Yes, just like as you did. You just took a leap in the pandemic into a whole new.
Yes.
Oh,
you've got to do it. Well, don't do it blindly. Don't do it blindly, friends. Yes. If it's something that you're compelled to do, you really have to follow that. I think that if you are a person who's been marginalized in any way, that means that you've also been told that you shouldn't, or that you can't, or that you will not be able to. And so you have to find a way to separate the voice inside your head that's telling you that I'm going to fall on my face. It's not going to happen. I'm going to mess this up. And then trust that you have the tools and the ability to do it. And that if you do make a mistake, because you are human, so it is inevitable that you will make a mistake, that you have the tools to figure out, to learn from it, or figure out a way to pivot. That to me has been the biggest thing, because if I'm honest, I was quite resistant to taking the job with Spotify. I loved the idea. I thought that was brilliant, and I was excited about it. But there was a not so little voice in my head saying, can you do it? You've got too much going on. You've got small kids. You're in the middle of a pandemic. There's some, family stuff going on that is really weighing you down. You need to spend all this time at home trying to deal with that. But the reality is that stuff was never going to go away.
That's true.
Right? But you have to ask yourself, well, how am I going to do this? And it's not a case of, when I took this job, I squeezed everything in and I made it work. No, there were adjustments, because I learned in 2020 in the hardest way that, and I lost my father in 2020, but I learned in the hardest way that sometimes you have to let something go in order for other things to come in. And what I learned was that, I had to let go of ideas of what my life or what my career was supposed to be, and really think about what I wanted. And that was the thing that led me to taking the job ultimately with Spotify. I mean, it's a big job and it sounds really shiny and really fantastic, but I work with a wonderful team and I am happy. I'm very, very happy doing that. But the thing that got me to take the leap was, you can do it and you can figure it out. And I heard voices, my husband, I had, friends, my family saying, no, you can do that. And I've heard that before. Oh, you can do it. But I'd be like, but I can do it. But to what, like, who loses? I lose because I'm going to be stressed out. But you don't have to be stressed out, because what's the thing in your life right now that you can either put a pause on or let go of in order for you to move on? And I think that's really, really important, because this idea of setting a boundary or saying no is not about, no, never doing that again. It's about, I can't do that right now. And it's about meeting responsibilities and meeting people where you are. And so that's what I would say.
Yeah, well, I think it was meant to be. And as I was learning a little bit more about the work that you do and uncovering a little bit more about Sound Up, where the program seems to be touching is all over the world, potentially, and particularly in the UK. And I know we have people that have joined us from different parts of the world. Could you tell us a little bit more what some of your co-workers are doing alongside behind the mic, and some of the other channels that Sound Up is working on right now, and things that people might not be aware of that they should check out after this?
Yes, I'll tell you what I can. Do what I can. So, I mean, Sound Up, I call it a division. I'm sure there's another term for it, but Sound Up is an incubator and workshop for podcasters. So it started off as, excuse me, I have some fluff in my eye that I cannot get out. There you go. I think I've done it. It's an incubator for underrepresented podcasters. Yes. So if you're a podcast host, or you have a podcast and an idea that you want to develop, the idea that the team at Sound Up came up with, and they came up with this honestly, actually, they came up with it not in reaction or to response to anything in the news. It's a really dedicated and multi-ethnic team, actually, of people who are saying, we got to figure this thing out. So they saw a need, and they wanted to empower podcasters to develop their show and see what it took, right, to work with people in the industry to develop their show concept in a workshop. And at the start, I think there were only 10 people who got through, and I think they got tens of thousands of people who applied in that first year to go into these incubators and workshops. And right now, Sound Up is in the UK, Brazil, Australia. We're all over the world. Yeah. We have 40, India, Japan. We are global. I think we're dealing with, if I get it right, no one shoot me if I get it wrong. I want to say 14 markets. Wow. And that's in 3 years. Wow. With podcasters and audio makers who are mentoring people who have podcasts who want to develop their ideas. And that is done through workshops. So it's about raising up a new generation of podcasters. So as a team, we're very intentional about changing the podcast industry. And we are changing the podcast industry because people are feeling empowered enough to create their own podcast companies and say, well, how can I be down? How can I help with all of this? And so Behind the Mic is an extension of that, in as much as we know that everybody doesn't want to be a host. Yeah. Some people want to know what happens. How is the sausage made? Some people want to do that. And so that's where Behind the Mic came in.
I love that. And for people who perhaps don't want to be a host, what other opportunities are there in podcasting that they might not already be aware of?
Oh my gosh, you can write, you can book guests, you can develop the podcast and then hand it off to a team. You can, you could be the person who's cutting the tape, not just as an audio engineer, but as, like the tape cutter. Goodness, you can be a production assistant. So you can get to see what happens. There's so many jobs and so many ways in which you can be involved in telling a story that doesn't require you being in front of a microphone.
Now, you're a storyteller, and before I ask you about the other podcasts we should be listening to, I want to talk about one that you've been working on, Sister Brunch. We've referenced it. Yes. Tell us more about it, how it came into be. And, I listened to an episode during the pandemic, and I loved the fact that it was exposing me to the work of women that I would never have known otherwise. Wow. If you could share it with us, that would be wonderful.
Goodness. I love me a sister brunch, just put it that way. I actually was approached by the two hosts, Anya Adams and Fanchon Cox, and they are two badass women in Hollywood who are changing the industry through their work. Anya is a director. She has directed episodes on Blackish, The Expanse. She's an NAACP award-winning director, and Fanchon is a co-author of The Inclusion Rider, and she works in development. And they said, we want to do this podcast where we basically amplify and celebrate Black women in Hollywood, because there are so many of them. But really what we want to do is use their stories to inspire other people who might want to break in. So the mission was, how do we inspire more people who might not know how to break into the industry to get in there? And the way that we, instead of saying, could you come on and help us develop it? So I developed the concept, and I said, well, people would be inspired by hearing these stories, because the Black women who break into the industry did not, for the most part, have contact. They had to work their butts off. They had to move from a different state or a different country or a different city, and they had to use their smarts and their hustle. And so really it was about learn by listening, right? And then, there were other things that we wanted to do. But so once I developed the concept and I said, well, based on what we have, let's keep it really simple and let's just keep it conversational and see what happens. But each of these conversations was so incredibly powerful. I was like, I don't really think you needed to do anything else other than, just stay on the interview game and really just have the conversations, do what you do well, which is listen, and then have your guests tell the story. We'd be taping and sometimes we'd all be in tears. And I'm not, I don't cry easy. Don't get it wrong. I'm not, the waterworks don't I get very emotional, but we just be sitting there shaking our heads like, goodness. We've talked about mental health. And how to navigate that. We've talked about all kinds of things. We've talked about how you protect yourself in a space where you are the only one, or you might be the only decision maker in the room. We talk about protecting yourself when you're really committed to bringing other people up with you. We've talked to screenwriters, we've talked to people who work behind the scenes, and it's just really, really empowering. It just, at the end of every taping, I would just walk away going, we're good. And now we have to have it so everyone else can hear it. So that's what Sister Brunch is about.
Yes, so if you haven't had the opportunity to listen to Sister Brunch, please do. I just, the depth of the conversation and just learning more about the work of women that I hadn't met, touching shows and content that I'm aware of was just really powerful to me. So it's such important work. And I would love to know what you're listening to and enjoying right now, and what you would recommend for us to check out in addition to Sister Brunch.
All right, we have quite a few here. So Dem Times is a podcast by a British collective called Our Day Media, and it is a fiction podcast. And it tells the story of this London kid who's sent back home to Ghana, to boarding school in Ghana. So already I was like, whoop, I've got to listen to this, because I grew up with friends, we're like, oh no, they got sent back home. Shame, you know what I mean? Like, that's it, it's a wrap. And so this podcast is about this boy that it happened to and how he navigated that world, but how he ultimately found himself. And it's really fun, it's really nice. I feel like I'm listening to it is a radio drama, actually. It's a radio drama with different characters and different voices, and it's fun. And I think by end of episode 1, I was laughing and howling. So there's one. Suave by Futura Media is about David Luis Suave Gonzalez, who is a man who served a life sentence in prison. And it's really about his very unusual relationship with the journalist Maria Hinojosa. If you're in the US, you may have heard of her. She founded Futura Media. And they use archival footage that she recorded, because as soon as she met him, she was rolling the tape, but also conversations with her and him when he was still in jail. And you see their relationship just kind of like unfolding and playing out. And it's really moving, but as a journalist as well, it really speaks to what objectivity is, and if it's necessary in all cases. And it's important. Objectivity is important, right? But sometimes, like, people have been accused, myself included, been accused of being an activist journalist. But as a Black journalist, as a journalist of color, it's something that you constantly think about. So it was really, really powerful, and the story is incredible too. And it's also meditation on how the US system has impacted Black and brown men in the United States. So it really got to me. It really got to me. The third one is appearances, and to put it simply, it's a mind trip. I remember, I don't know where fiction starts and fact begins with this one, so it's very experimental, but I couldn't stop listening to it. The story was just really good, and it's about an Iranian American woman, but the Iranian American-ness of her life is not told, it's just shown. But it's about her as a woman, an American woman, struggling or just trying to get through this part of her life and trying to figure some stuff out. So again, it's really just, it's really, really interesting. The next one is King of Crenshaw, and it's about the late rapper and community leader Nipsey Hussle. And for me, I don't hear very many podcasts that really delve deep into Black male relationships. And within the first 5 minutes, I was crying.
Gosh.
I was crying. And like, often when we talk about, or we show the Black experience, it's really about, kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not approval, but you're supposed to be a particular way, right? But Nipsey Hussle was a member of a gang, right? And that's what everyone focuses on. But he was so much more than that, and so you get to unpeel that, but you also get to see these beautiful friendships, and that it really delves into who he was as an Eritrean American, essentially. I believe that's where he's from, right? So that is one that I recommend everybody listen to. And one from Ghana is called Sincerely Accra, which is a little spicy. People. It reveals an Accra that I never knew existed, because when you're a diaspora, you don't go all the time. I knew it existed, but to hear it's a hosted show, it's an interview show, and it's really irreverent. Sometimes I'm like, why are you putting all your business out there? Like, stop, where's the line? But I do nothing but laugh. And what I love about this podcast is that they're talking to people in Accra, they're talking to Ghanaians. And it's really refreshing, because they're not looking out to try and show the world who they are. It's literally we're having this conversation, you can join in if you want. And as a diasporan, I love joining in, right? And the host goes between, we call it Tringlish, right? So like Tree or Ga and English. So like you can hear 3 different languages being spoken on this show, right? I speak 1.5 of them, and I can follow along perfectly well. And it just warms the cockles.
Oh, well, that's an impressive collection. Thank you for sharing that with us and for answering all of my questions. And I'm going to turn it back over to Diggs. He's going to have a few questions for you from our attendees.
Indeed, and thank you both for that wonderful discussion. I just, on a personal note, I co-host a podcast with my co-working space, so it was lovely to hear the sort of the process of sort of getting over the like, oh, how do we do this? How do we get this out? Will people listen? This is, I was having flashbacks in a good way. But to our questions, the first was asked in the sense of, what advice would you give to marginalized folk, or let's say historically marginalized folk, or systemically marginalized folk, who want to tell their stories but don't necessarily have the skills themselves? And how do you, if you're partnering with someone who isn't also of a marginalized background, how do you keep that person from diluting your story through the sort of technical aspects of the work?
Oh, such a big question. Okay, so the first part, how do you tell the stories of systemically marginalized people? Is that the first
So
part of it?
sort of like it's more about what advice would you give to someone who wants to be in podcasting who doesn't necessarily have the skills and the person themselves is marginalized, and if they have to partner with someone that is not also of a marginalized background, how do they then make sure that the tech side of things doesn't dilute their story?
Okay, well, first of all, you should just start. You should just start by, and if it's a case of just starting by recording the interviews or by recording your conversation, you should just start. I think that's the first thing. We get really freaked out about, well, how many people are going to listen? And is it important? It's important. It's just important to start and to do it. And you will quickly figure out what works for you in terms of the recording, in terms of how you approach it, whether you need to write an intro, whether you're good at doing intros, you know, or whether you can just kind of wing it because, you know, you can think fast, and plan. So when you're doing that, because you're not sure about how to approach it, really think about what you want to do. It's almost like writing an essay, but it doesn't have to be as, you know, as taxing if you don't like writing essays. I like writing essays, so I say that. But, you know, really sit down and plan about what is it you want to say and how you want to do it. And sometimes if you can't figure it out, just do the thing. Just stick the microphone in front of someone and then start, listen, and then think about what you like and what you don't like. In terms of having to partner with somebody who may not be from a systemically marginalized background, it's your story. And it's your show. And so you should stand firm in basically saying that this is your vision, right? And it doesn't matter regardless of whether that person has not been systemically marginalized or not. I think any good producer, the idea of a producer is that if you have a concept, right? Because I do this all the time. If you have a concept and you have asked me to come on to produce it, the idea is not for me to produce my vision of the show, unless you ask me to, unless you say, I don't know what this thing is, what is it supposed to be? My job is to give you the tools to tell you your story. And so if you're working with somebody who is of a different background and you feel like they're encroaching on it, stand firm and you say, this is the story I'm trying to tell. Can you, I'm looking to partner with you. Don't see power. I'm partnering with you to figure out how to tell this story. I think it's really important about, how you view yourself, how you view your story, because it is, which means that you're the expert. A very smart woman told me this a lot. You are the expert. Even if you don't think you are the expert. And stand firm in that. I hope that answers the question.
I hope so too. If I get a response, I will let you know. There are two more questions. We might have time for one more if there's if somebody wants to pop one more in. The second was in the chat, so I hope Trisha doesn't mind me identifying her, but she said that she is a former radio journalist with a dream of starting her own podcast, but can't get over that fear that no one will listen. So I know you said just start and get going, but are there like truly specific strategies to just like that starting process of just like hitting record on that first podcast?
Well, let's go back a little bit. If she's scared that no one will listen, who's the audience? Start with that. Is there an audience for your podcast? And if you know who that audience is, then tailor the show for them. Number one. Number two, if that's the case, envision who that person is. Who are you talking to in that podcast? Number one. In terms of you're being scared about no one will listen. Oh, we all have that. I have that all the time. But you do have to do it. You have to start the thing, right? And then once you've done that, because when you start the thing, that starts to give you the confidence and the audacity, which is a good word, people, the audacity to start seeking out the people in the community who you think will listen to the show. Because when you start, you'll continue to refine your message. You'll start refining it to yourself. And when people say, oh, what it's about, you will stumble and you will stammer. But you have to get into the process of selling it and telling people all the time, my show is about X. First time you do it, it's going to be horrible. And then you're going to take a note and you're going to write it down and you're going to say, well, this is the thing. This is the thing. And then you have to get comfortable with telling people. No one's going to listen to it if you don't talk about it because they don't know it exists. So you have to get into the habit of telling people about it. Even from the process of, I'm in the middle of doing this thing, check it out. Oh, when is it coming out? It's coming out soon. Now, it may not be ready, and you might think that you're screwing yourself over. You're not. It's putting some fire under you. Take it from someone who knows. I do that all the time.
Thanks, Christabel. So 2 more questions. One is, it'd be interesting to hear your take on pitching the story, how you've done it in the past and the approaches that work, and how do you then also tell your story if there's a separate answer to that?
So approaches to pitching, you always have to find the hook. So coming from news, that hook for me is the news hook a lot of the time. But if you're doing a news story, so what is happening today, what is happening this week, what makes it relevant? But the what makes it relevant part is important, whether it's news or whether it's fiction, right? Why, I dislike the phrasing of this question, but it is important. Why should I care, right? But you have to think about who that why is. I phrase it differently, as in like, why is your story important, right? Don't look for the why should I, as in someone else. Why do I, as in you, care? Because once you understand what the important thing is in your story, you'll be able to sell that story to people. But at the same time, if you're talking about your story, what is it about your story that resonates with everybody else, right? Is it that you're a left-handed woman living in Los Angeles? Well, how many left-handed women in Los Angeles, are there? And so is that my audience? And so what is it that's interesting about that part of my journey? So really think about the thing that makes the story unique, but will resonate, I want to say universally, but it doesn't have to be universally, but resonate with a lot of other people.
Awesome, thank you for that. And our last question is from Nadine in the chat. So I'll paraphrase it, but essentially she's looking to sort of get a sense of sponsorships or even funding. How she, in her case, she has a core team with technical ability to produce, but there's no money for the project and she can't dip into her own funds to help pay them. Does she need an LLC? Does there need to be official letterhead? What does she need to sort of pitch production companies to pick her up and make sure that her folks get compensated?
Oh, good question. I mean, in my experience, an LLC helps because it organizes everything, right? It organizes everything. There's an organization, there's a structure to things. But at the end of the day, if you're looking to pitch an idea to people, you got to reach out. I mean, are you making connections with people who take pictures? Who are you speaking to? Because that really is the critical thing. The LLC part is about the organization. But if you're looking to pitch an idea, you don't necessarily need the LLC. That comes further down the line. It's about who's in the network that you need to speak to, who could pick up your idea so that you could produce the show. Because that's where we're at. If you can't dip into your own wallet and you can't crowdfund, which a lot of people are doing, by the way, and I have no opinion on that either way, because you could do it independently, and maybe that's the way to do it. If you want your show to be picked up, the first thing you have to do is try and build those connections.
Indeed. And I know that there is other, like the crowdfunding, if you're interested. I know I've seen GoFundMe's for folks with podcasts, Patreon, where you can or you can sort of sponsor a podcast and or I think they have different levels of sponsorship there. But with that,
Patreon, I'm going to jump in there because I think that's an interesting. Just do research on that and you go down that rabbit hole.
Sounds like a plan. So that was our last question. Before I turn it back to Octavia, just to say goodbye to all of you, let me just say that this recording will hopefully be available by tomorrow morning Eastern time. There will all the links that we shared throughout the chat will be shared in a follow-up email via Eventbrite. On behalf of RSA US and the wider RSA community, I'd like to say thank you to Octavia and Christabel for this wonderful conversation. And with that, Octavia, back to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Diggs. Thank you so much, Christabel, for making the space to share your journey, the work you are doing, and advice for aspiring podcasters. It was so powerful. And thank you, everyone, for adding another Zoom to your day. today and making space for us. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.